The last thing my grandfather ever said to me was, "Sometimes the biggest betrayals come wrapped in the prettiest packages, sweetheart." I was too young to understand what he meant back then, but if I had known what was coming, I might have listened more closely. My name is Naomi, and just last week, I stood in my grandfather's Victorian house, the one he had promised me since I was 12, watching as my family stole my inheritance right out from under me. The air in the room felt heavy, not just with the lingering scent of Grandpa Henry's old tobacco pipe, but with the weight of unspoken truths. The lawyer had barely finished reading the will before my mother, Vivian, reached for the house keys with her perfectly manicured hand, the same hand that had once tucked me into bed and now clutched the symbol of my stolen future. "Honey, you have to understand," she cooed, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sympathy that could convince a stranger she was a saint. "The house needs so many repairs. We're just trying to protect you from that burden." I glanced at my father, Gregory, who sat stiffly in the chair beside her, eyes downcast, his silence a confession of guilt. "Protect me?" I repeated, my voice hollow. My fingers tightened around the envelope Grandpa had left me. "By selling the house without telling me?" Lucas, my older brother, leaned lazily against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, that smug half-smile playing on his lips. "Come on, Naomi. You couldn't afford the property taxes anyway." His words stung, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they were meant to cut me down. Just 3 weeks ago, I had been sitting in the sunroom with Grandpa, sharing tea while he told stories about his youth, filling the room with his warm laughter. And now, here they were, dividing up his life's work like vultures, picking over a fresh carcass. "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "Grandpa left it to me. It's in the will." Olivia, my younger sister, barely looked up from where she sat on the sofa, filing her nails. "Actually," she said wryly, "Mom and Dad have power of attorney. The sale has already gone through." The words hit me like a slap. "What sale?" My stomach twisted. "We found a lovely buyer," Vivian said smoothly, smoothing down the crisp fabric of her blouse as if that made everything acceptable. "He offered well above market value. The papers are signed." A slow, creeping numbness spread through me. My fingers dug into the unopened envelope in my hands, the one that had arrived by courier that morning with strict instructions from Grandpa's lawyer to wait until after the will reading. "Get out," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Vivian sighed as if I were being childish. "Don't be dramatic, Naomi. We're family." "Family?" A dry laugh escaped me, bitter and sharp. "Family doesn't do this. Get out of my grandfather's house. Now." For the first time, silence stretched between us. One by one, they filed out, their expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. My mother lingered in the doorway, tilting her head in that patronizing way she always did when she thought she was being reasonable. "We're meeting the buyer tomorrow to hand over the keys. You should come. Make peace with it." Then she was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the ornate crown molding, the stained glass windows, the carved wooden staircase. Every inch of this house had been Grandpa's pride and joy, and now it was being ripped from me. Swallowing hard, I forced my trembling fingers to tear open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. "My dearest Naomi," it began in Grandpa's neat, slanted handwriting. "If you're reading this, they've done exactly what I feared they would. But don't worry. I've left you something they don't know about, something that will help you fight back. Check behind the loose brick in the garden wall. The one with the heart carved into it." A flicker of something sparked in my chest, not hope, not yet, but something close to it. Grandpa always said that the best revenge was served with patience and wisdom. And from the grave, it seemed he had left me a recipe. Sleep never found me that night. I tossed and turned, the weight of Grandpa's letter pressing against my chest like an anchor. His words played on a relentless loop in my mind, each sentence twisting deeper into my thoughts. Something they don't know about. Something that will help you fight back. My family had taken everything from me, my home, my trust, and the last remaining piece of Grandpa's legacy. But what if he had left me more than just an empty promise? The first light of dawn barely crept over the horizon when I pulled on a jacket and slipped outside into the cool, dewy air. The garden smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, the stone pathway glistening under the faint glow of the porch light. I had walked this path 100 times before, but today, every step felt heavier, more deliberate, as if I were following breadcrumbs left by Grandpa himself. When I reached the garden wall, I traced my fingers along the weathered brick surface, searching for the mark. It had been years since I had last noticed it, but there it was, a small heart, crudely carved, almost obscured by the creeping ivy. My hands trembled as I wedged my fingers between the bricks, feeling for the one that was loose. After a few tries, the brick shifted, and with one final tug, it came free. Nestled in the dark hollow behind it was a plastic-wrapped bundle. I pulled it out, dust and bits of mortar clinging to my fingers, and unwrapped it with growing urgency. Inside, I found a set of folded papers, yellowed at the edges but still intact. My breath hitched as I recognized Grandpa's handwriting on the top page, his meticulous script as familiar as my own name. I carried the bundle inside and spread the papers out on the kitchen table, my eyes darting across the text. It was all legal documentation, property records, amendments to his will, notarized agreements. As I flipped through them, one particular line stopped me cold. The estate shall not be sold without the explicit written consent of Naomi Whitaker, overriding any power of attorney. I read it once. Then again. And again, until the words lost meaning. My hands clenched around the pages as the truth crashed into me like a tidal wave. The sale of the house was illegal. My mother, my father, my siblings, they had gone through with it, knowing full well that Grandpa had put safeguards in place. But if my signature was required, and I had never signed anything, my stomach dropped. Someone had forged my name. A sickening rage settled in my chest, burning away the last remnants of grief that had softened my anger. This wasn't just deceit, it was fraud. They hadn't just taken advantage of my absence. They had actively worked to erase me from my own inheritance. I felt the sting of betrayal morph into something sharper, something fueled by a determination I hadn't known I possessed. I didn't hesitate. Within minutes, I had the documents tucked into my bag, my keys in hand, and my car speeding toward the law office of Adrian Walsh. The office was quiet when I arrived, the faint aroma of leather-bound books and fresh coffee hanging in the air. Adrian, an older woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, adjusted her reading glasses as I laid the papers before her. Her brows lifted slightly as she scanned the pages, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "Well," she murmured, flipping through the documents with practiced efficiency, "your grandfather was certainly thorough." I swallowed the knot in my throat. "Can they legally sell the house without my consent?" My voice was steadier than I expected, but the tension in my fingers betrayed my restraint. Adrian leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. "That's where things get interesting," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Your grandfather filed an amendment to his will 6 months before he passed. According to this clause, the house cannot be sold without your explicit, written permission. Power of attorney doesn't override this stipulation." The words settled over me like a thick fog. My hands tightened into fists as I thought back to my mother's cold, indifferent tone, my father's averted gaze, Olivia's smug certainty. They had spoken as if the sale was final, as if there was nothing I could do. "But my mother said the sale already went through," I murmured, trying to piece it together. "How is that possible?" Adrian pulled a sheet from the stack, turning it toward me. The text blurred as my gaze landed on the bottom of the page, on the signature line where my name was neatly printed in cursive. "Because someone forged your signature," she said simply. My vision tunneled. The letters on the page twisted into something unrecognizable as the full realization sank in. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They had deliberately stolen the house out from under me, knowing I had no idea what Grandpa had planned. Adrian leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the sharp edge of opportunity. "Tell me, Naomi. Where were you on this date?" I forced myself to focus, scanning the timestamp. Then I nearly laughed. Chicago, I said. I was in Chicago for work. I have flight receipts, hotel bookings, credit card statements. Good, Adrian said, already reaching for her phone. Keep them. We're going to need them, I exhaled shakily. So, what happens now? She slid the contract back toward me, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against my supposed signature. Forgery is a felony, Naomi. And whoever did this is going to regret underestimating you. A sharp knock on the door interrupted us. Adrian glanced at her watch, then at me. That would be Malcolm Reeves. The man who thinks he legally bought your house. My blood turned to ice. Malcolm Reeves was the kind of man who exuded confidence. He walked into Adrian's office with the easy assurance of someone accustomed to making deals, the kind who assumed that paperwork was just a formality, that money could smooth over any complication. But as he stepped into the room and took in my expression, something shifted. His eyes darted between me and the stack of documents on Adrian's desk, and for the first time, I saw it, that flicker of doubt, the faint crack in his certainty. Adrian motioned toward the chair across from me, her expression cool and unreadable. Mr. Reeves, please have a seat. Malcolm hesitated before lowering himself into the chair, his hands clasped together on the polished wood of the desk. I assume this is about the house? Adrian leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. That's correct. We have reason to believe that the sale of the Whitaker estate was conducted under fraudulent circumstances. She slid the contract toward him, tapping the signature line. Specifically, this signature. It's a forgery, a sharp breath left Malcolm's lips. He took the document, scanning it as if expecting some trick, as if my signature might suddenly come to life and validate the deal he thought he had made. But as the silence stretched between us, his expression darkened. He lifted his gaze to mine. Your mother assured me you had signed these papers. That you agreed to the sale, but didn't want to be there for the formalities. My stomach clenched at the words. It was almost laughable, how easily my family had rewritten reality to suit their needs. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had rewritten me, turned me into a passive figure, someone incapable of standing up for what was hers. I leaned forward, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. They lied to you, I said simply. Adrian slid another sheet forward, a printed record of my flight history. Naomi was in Chicago on the day this contract was signed. We have receipts, timestamps, surveillance footage. She was nowhere near the estate. This sale is invalid, Mr. Reeves. Malcolm dragged a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Damn it. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair. I knew something felt off. Your mother and father were insistent that everything be done quickly. They made it seem like you were the only obstacle in an otherwise seamless transaction. His words left a bitter taste in my mouth. And you didn't think to check? He met my gaze, unflinching. I should have. That's on me. But if what you're saying is true, then the sale doesn't hold. I have no intention of keeping a property obtained through fraud. Adrian folded her arms. That's wise, Mr. Reeves. However, you should be aware that this situation is bigger than just a forged signature. Something in her tone made Malcolm's posture stiffen. What do you mean? I pushed the folder of emails toward him. Take a look at these. You were never the first choice. My family has been shopping the house around to buyers since before my grandfather even passed away. His brows furrowed as he flipped through the pages. The emails laid everything bare. The casual way my mother and father had spoken about liquidating Grandpa's home, the blatant disregard for his final wishes, the push to close a sale as soon as possible. But what caught my attention the most was a particular exchange dated 2 days after Grandpa's funeral. Your mother mentioned there might be resistance, Malcolm murmured, reading aloud. She said you were too emotionally attached to see the financial opportunity. A sick sort of laughter bubbled in my throat. That was how they had framed it. Not as theft, not as deception, but as a business transaction hindered by my emotions. My fingers curled against my lap. What else did she tell you? I asked. Malcolm hesitated before setting the papers down. She mentioned hidden valuables. That the house contained something your grandfather had tucked away. Something worth securing before you had a chance to find it. Adrian and I exchanged a glance. I thought of the small brass key Grandpa had left me, the way he had worded his final letter. Something they don't know about. Something that will help you fight back. Did she say what it was? I pressed. No. Malcolm shook his head. Just that they needed to close the sale quickly and ensure full access to the property before you started asking too many questions. A chill ran down my spine. My family had been frantic to finalize the sale, not just for the money, but for something else. Something inside that house. Adrian steepled her fingers. Mr. Reeves, will you provide a formal statement on this? Yes. His answer was immediate. I don't want any part of this mess. And if your family forged documents to push this through, they deserve whatever legal consequences come their way. My phone buzzed against the desk. I glanced down. Tessa, they're meeting tonight at Parkview Hotel. Something about the house. Thought you should know. The knot in my stomach tightened. What is it? Adrian asked. I exhaled sharply. I think I just found out where my parents are planning their next move. The Parkview Hotel was one of those places that exuded quiet luxury, polished marble floors, dim lighting, the kind of lobby where expensive deals were made behind closed doors. It didn't surprise me that my family had chosen it for whatever scheme they were planning next. Adrian and I arrived 30 minutes before the meeting, checking into a room directly beside the one Tessa had mentioned. We pressed our ears to the thin hotel wall, the muffled voices just clear enough to make out. We need that money transferred before the audit hits. My mother's voice cut through the quiet. We know, Vivian, my father snapped. But Naomi's lawyer is a problem. Adrian's pen moved swiftly across her notepad, every word carefully recorded. Then fix it, Gregory, my mother hissed. We didn't spend 30 years building this business just to have it crumble because Henry decided to play favorites from beyond the grave. Something inside me twisted. My hands curled into fists. What about the paintings? Another voice, one I didn't recognize. They're still in the house, my father confirmed. Behind the wooden panels in the study. That's why we need to move fast. My heart pounded. Paintings? Adrian's eyes met mine. Insurance fraud, she mouthed. It clicked all at once. The real reason Grandpa had changed his will. The real reason my family had gone to such desperate lengths to steal the house. It wasn't just about money. It was about stolen art, art that was hidden away, smuggled through my father's business, and now, sitting untouched in the house my family had tried to steal from me. My phone buzzed again. A new message from Tessa. They don't know I'm here. I heard Mom say something about needing to get back into the house before it's too late. Whatever they're planning, it's happening tonight. Adrian straightened, grabbing her phone. I'm calling a contact. We need to get to that house before they do. I didn't hesitate. I gripped the wheel as Adrian and I pulled up to Grandpa's house, keeping the headlights off. The place loomed in the dark, silent but heavy with the weight of buried secrets. My family had spent months trying to rip this house from me, and now I knew why. It wasn't just about money, it was about something hidden inside, something they were desperate to retrieve before I uncovered the truth. Adrian checked her phone. No alarm logs yet. They haven't come back, at least, not officially. That gave us an opening, but not much time. If my family was planning to make their move tonight, we needed to be inside first. I gripped the brass key in my pocket and moved toward the back entrance, Adrian close behind. The house was supposed to be locked, but the moment I pressed on the handle, the door gave way. Someone had already been here. We slipped inside, the air stale with the scent of dust and something else, aged wood, maybe, but it carried a lingering weight of secrecy. I led us toward the study, where Grandpa used to spend hours reading, where he had likely hidden whatever was important enough to spark this whole mess. Adrian kept watch as I ran my fingers along the wall's wooden paneling, searching for anything out of place. Then, there it was, a faint groove along the base, a section where the wood didn't quite align. I crouched, slipping the key into the tiny, nearly invisible keyhole. A click, then the panel slid open. Inside the compartment sat a stack of paintings, wrapped in protective cloth, their frames ornate and unmistakably expensive. But before I could process the significance, Adrian sucked in a sharp breath. Naomi, these aren't just valuable. These are stolen artworks. The pieces clicked together instantly. My father's business had been a front for laundering stolen art, and Grandpa had known. That's why he had changed the will. He wasn't just protecting the house, he was trying to protect his legacy from being tainted by the crime his own son had buried within its walls. Footsteps sounded from outside. Adrian met my eyes, her grip tightening around her phone. They're here. The moment I heard the footsteps, I knew we were out of time. The study door creaked open, and my mother was the first to step inside, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing on the open panel in the wall. For a second, she hesitated, her perfectly controlled expression flickering with something close to disbelief. My father stood behind her, his face drawn and pale, while Lucas and Olivia lingered near the doorway, their presence adding to the suffocating weight of the moment. The truth was exposed now, sitting in plain sight between us, the stolen artwork, hidden away within the walls of Grandpa's house, the very thing they had gone to such great lengths to keep from me. I expected them to deny it, to scramble for some kind of justification, but no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. My mother inhaled sharply, as if preparing to compose herself, but the sight of the hidden compartment had already unraveled whatever control she had left. My father was the first to break, letting out a slow exhale, running a hand down his face. He knew. He had known this was coming the moment I started asking questions, and now, there was nothing left to deflect, no more lies that could bury the reality of what they had done. Adrian, standing beside me, shifted slightly, her phone still recording. There was nothing left to argue over. The evidence was all here, locked in canvas and oil paint, proof of a crime my family had spent years covering up. My mind raced back to the will, to Grandpa's warning, to the clause he had so carefully put in place. He had known they would do this. He had known they would stop at nothing to erase his last safeguard. And now, here we were, at the edge of their downfall. The distant sound of car doors slamming outside cut through the moment like a blade. A flicker of realization passed through my mother's face, followed by something colder, sharper, recognition that it was over. Red and blue lights flashed through the stained glass windows, distorting the once warm colors into something fractured and unfamiliar. The police had arrived. My father stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides, as if bracing for impact. Lucas turned toward the door, his breath coming in uneven bursts, and Olivia, silent until now, closed her eyes briefly before stepping back, distancing herself from the unraveling chaos. My mother squared her shoulders, forcing a deep breath, but the weight of the moment had finally settled on her. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Officers entered, the air shifting with their presence as they moved with practiced efficiency. My mother and father offered no resistance as they were questioned, their responses clipped, their once confident facade now nothing more than a hollow mask. Lucas, despite his usual bravado, was uncharacteristically quiet, his defiance drained from him as he absorbed the consequences of what had been set in motion. Olivia, for all her indifference, seemed frozen in place, her gaze locked on the paintings, as if seeing them for the first time for what they really were, evidence, not inheritance. I stood back, watching as it all unfolded, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction. Just exhaustion. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was a reckoning, a long overdue collapse of the web of lies that had bound this family together. And when my mother finally turned to look at me, as the officers led them outside, there was no plea for understanding, no last-ditch attempt to manipulate the situation. Just silence. A silent acknowledgement that, in the end, she had lost. As the house emptied, the stolen paintings carefully catalogued and prepared for transport, Adrian turned to me, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew what this meant. The legal battle ahead would be long, but the house, my house, was no longer in question. The estate would be mine, just as Grandpa had intended. And as I stepped into the now empty study, the weight of everything settling onto my shoulders, I knew one thing with certainty. My family had built their empire on deception, but in the end, truth had been the one thing they couldn't outrun. As I ran my fingers over the worn edges of Grandpa's desk, I could almost hear his voice again, calm and steady, reminding me that the greatest betrayals often come wrapped in the prettiest packages. I had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. But I had also learned something else, something my family never had. Some things are worth fighting for, and this house, this legacy, this truth, I had one, and this time, no one would take it from me.